22 years into South Africa's democracy, black fund management firms in 2014 managed less than 7% of assets in the industry. The industry is estimated to have assets worth about 5 trillion rand. That's not very much in the hands of black asset managers. This is the Moneymakers. I'm Bruce Whitfield. Tonight, as ABSIP kicks off its investment management summit, we ask about the role of transformation for growth in an economy that's not growing at all. Joining me from our Cape Town studios, Delphine Govender. She's Deputy President of ABSIP and the founder of Perpertua. Delphine Govender, that was 2014 number. Have things improved since 2014?
Sadly not, Bruce. While, in fact, as you would know, the entire pool of assets has grown for the South African market as a whole, the share that's being managed by majority black-owned firms hasn't grown. So the percentages still remain pretty low. And I think ultimately that's what we're seeking to address, and that we're seeking to ensure that in a time that's not too far away, that we can see some meaningful improvement on that kind of number.
Why is there not improvement?
Well, I think it's a multi-layered answer to that question. And interestingly, the issue of black firms not having significant share of assets in the industry is obviously both historic. And I think you have to ask yourself the question as how are assets allocated in the industry? So it's not just simply, you start a fund management firm and you have a divine right to being allocated assets because you promise a return at some point in time by following a specific approach, or having a specific descriptor in terms of your status or your ownership that automatically qualifies you to having assets. So I think any fund management firm that starts understands that that's not how it works. Having said that, I think what one needs is the opportunity, as any firm would be, whether you're small, large or established, to get in front of the decision makers, whether they be the consultants, the multi-managers, or ultimately the funds themselves, to explain what your capabilities are, explain what it is that you offer that you believe is a value proposition for that client in your competence of the services that you render. And ultimately, we're wondering, we're trying to unpack, both as an industry association, being ABSIP, as to why are there some structural issues about the way the industry is intermediated, the way the assets flow in the industry, that is preventing particularly majority black-owned firms and perhaps all small firms from necessarily getting to scale. And is there perhaps a system that perpetuates the existence of the large players to the detriment of the small players? Because we actually believe a vibrant, diverse, inclusive industry will ultimately serve for client outcomes that will be benefited, not just simply for the small players to gain.
In 1994, in the Western Cape, very few wine labels. The labels that we remember, Mealist had a label that people would recognize from those days. There was Nederburg. There were a couple of, probably 20, 30 wine labels that were recognizable. Today, they're close to 1,000 wine labels. And the asset management industry, frankly, feels very, very similar. You've got people who grow up in the traditional asset management industry. They bump their heads against the glass ceiling. They get bored. They get upset. They fight with their boss, and they go into business for themselves. Isn't this as much a competition issue amongst the smaller players as anything else?
Well, I think you're touching on several points. And so absolutely, this is about an evolution of an industry. And naturally, and it would be the evolution of any industry. We can talk about the tech industry. We could talk about, you mentioned the wine industry as an example. It's the nature of humanity. It's the nature of how industries develop. You have entrepreneurial instincts. You have people that cut their teeth in established firms and then move on because they think they can do something different or better, or different and better. And we would think that who benefits would be the end consumer, whether it be a fund or a natural consumer. So it's not surprising that we see this natural cycle of entrepreneurial, instinct that occurs. And in fact, economies need this. Our economy needs this. And that's why even in the summit, we're talking about not just transformation for BEE or transformation for a scorecard or transformation because it's the thing that should be done. We're saying we want transformation for growth. And so when you come back to the issue of competition, and are there too many small firms competing with each other? Probably there are always going to be too many small firms or too many subscale firms. And the question we're trying to work out is that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Competition is never a bad thing. What we should always have is a system that promotes healthy competition. The large players tend to do that better than small players because they don't need to worry about survival to the same extent. And perhaps we're wondering, because you have so many subscale players in so many industries, the failure rate get happens to be higher. And is there a way that one can address that by promoting the ability for smaller players to really get scale without necessarily becoming mega?
Yeah, I mean, if you're the Public Investment Corporation and you've got state pensioners' assets that you want invested, there are also only a limited number of players that you can see in any given year. You're going to go and see the Coronations, the Old Mutuals, the Sanlams, the Discoveries of the world, and the Investex of the world, and say to them, right, how are you going to manage our money? And then you're going to throw in a couple of the smaller players into that mix, because you can't afford to be managing 100 small relationships. Rather, manage the relationships with the big players. It's a question of scale, very much so, surely.
I would suppose so. So it's ultimately any allocator, any fund will have their approach, and so we're not trying to mess with what the fund has an approach. We are questioning, as an industry body, we're questioning whether we're a small player or a large player. It doesn't matter what your identity is, because many of us wear many hats in any industry. We're questioning whether, firstly, funds have a stated approach. Often, in fact, they don't. They don't have a formal policy for how they go about, appointing a consultant, or go about for that consultant to see, further on research managers, whether they be new. There's very little that's formalized. And so to the extent that we can suggest or improve for there to be some sort of formalized policy, whether it be for the percentage of the assets of that fund that should be in the hands of large players, small players, even from a strategy perspective, should it be, from a global, domestic, asset classes. So we're saying funds, it would be fantastic if you could actually have formalized policies about how you go about, number one, allocating assets, number two, how you think about the inclusion of whether they be new managers, new asset classes, new product sets, so that it's clear as to what it is that the objectives of that fund are. And it's not just simply, everyone has an automatic right to the table, but it also then sets the rules of the game. This is what one needs. At the moment, we're dealing with a lot of legacy that simply continues because that's how it happened. And we're saying, how on earth does one promote entrepreneurial instinct? How does one promote small firms? All the mega firms today were once, whether it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago, tiny little boutiques, and they made it. That's been fantastic as a success story for South Africa. How do we have more of those in South Africa?
One word, performance. And I guess when you sit around and present to trustees, they're going to say, what is we give you a mandate, how will you perform? And it's about meeting those performance criteria. Just how good are your members at doing that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This endeavor does not exist. Investing is entirely about delivering on an outcome, but in order to do that, you obviously are explaining to your client that you have an approach, a recipe that you believe will deliver an outcome that is in line with what the client is expecting of you. And ultimately, if you don't do that, you breach that trust and that credibility, which is probably the reason you were hired in the first place. Ultimately, in fact, I wonder whether the industry is sometimes incorrectly perceived, and that fund managers are not necessarily selling performance per se. We should not be hired just because at the start of a year we had a fantastic year the previous year. One wants to know that the performance is an outcome of an approach that you're following. Each firm has its own unique value proposition if it's going to exist into time immemorial and be something that is a great success story. And so we're not at all saying that there's a grouping or a bucket that should get an allocation because they tick a few characteristics. Performance is ultimately, of course, what funds are after, and what firms, irrespective of whether you're majority black owned or majority white owned, are offering. It's a value proposition. It's the whole deal. Ultimately, the tricky thing we face is that one doesn't even get to, when you're a smaller firm, have those conversations about the value proposition you're bringing if there's no equal opportunity to sit in front of a client. So some of the outcomes, yes?
Is it time to see some consolidation amongst the smaller players? We've seen the proliferation of smaller players. If there are just too many small players, isn't it time for like-minded individuals to create players of greater substance so that when you do knock on the boardroom door, it gets open to you?
That's an option. So to the extent that consolidation will naturally occur, the question is that should it be something that is a natural meeting of minds between like-minded entrepreneurs or individuals that have a common vision in what they're trying to achieve. We would hope many of the existing, subscale, I would like to say, players in the industry have quite similar overlapping visions. How they plan to execute on that vision might differ. So to the extent there is that natural meeting of minds, by all means, that should be a conversation. It does not necessarily mean every industry, and our industry itself will go through the cycle of subscale firms. They reach maturity, natural failure, firms that then will seek to consolidate, not just necessarily for survival, but because they actually believe that together they believe they are building something critical. Bear in mind that there are many large houses themselves that have had to go through their own routes of consolidation. It might just be called something different. It might be a restructuring, a new approach. So to the extent that small managers can believe that there's enough similarity between other firms that are like-minded, and together they will make three and not just 1 + 1, then by all means we support that. There's no silver bullet in saying this is that every single firm must be, then the industry must have the exact numbers of players in 10 years from now.
Deputy President of ABSIP, she's the founder of one of the small firms, Perpertua. She's joined us on the MoneyMakers this evening. How does transformation happen in an economy that is not growing and in an environment where the scale is just not adequate for the smaller players to have the boardroom door open to them? Lots of thorny issues, lots of issues to discuss. Thank you so much for watching. Alan Gray was once a small firm. It was just one guy called Alan Gray. Coronation was a bunch of renegades who left Old Mutual. These are the big players today. Who will be the big players of the future? Keep watching. Bye-bye.